I'm Christina, and this is
Ian.
and today we are here with Sanchali from Joro. Sanchali, I would love to introduce you, but I think you'll probably do a better job introducing yourself. Do you want to tell us a little bit about you and about Joro?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Sanchali. I am the founder and CEO of Joro, which is an app that helps people manage the carbon footprint of how they spend money so they can build a more sustainable life. I started building the company about 3 years ago after my own journey trying to live more sustainably, but finding it very difficult to do so. And in my previous life, I worked in international development. I lived and worked in India and in Ethiopia, working for a company called Dahlberg.
Okay. And I saw your company and some of the dates of the blog, just out of curiosity. Did you start right before COVID or right as COVID was kicking off? It looked like that time frame was kind of aligned right there. That must have been really interesting.
Yes, it was. We started just before COVID. Was building the first sort of prototype of the app and testing it with users in early 2019. Then got into an accelerator in sort of mid-late 2019 and raised our first sort of pre-seed funding, and then launched the app in April 2020, just as COVID was hitting.
That's pretty remarkable. And today, here you are. I think probably from the beginning of 2020 to now, you saw a lot of good impact from a carbon offset standpoint with none of us commuting. We were at home more. Probably if we were all using the app, we would have saw some positive impact there. But from an app standpoint, we were taking a look at it, and it sounds like, tell us if we're right, we download the app, we connect it to our credit card, or we can estimate it, and we put in there just what our buying behaviors are. And then we can see how much carbon we're emitting and what behaviors we can do to change that, or essentially to donate to one of the companies you have or funds you have identified that are looking at carbon offsets. Did we get the gist right?
A great description. Yes, okay. Exactly.
Excellent.
People can choose to either answer a few questions or ideally answer a few questions and connect their spending. And we use that and combine it with national and local information on carbon footprints of different products and services to help you see a real-time picture of the emissions in your lifestyle so that you can take action on it in whatever way you decide to, whether that's supporting carbon offsetting projects or taking other actions in your life to live more sustainably, from your finances to how you eat to how you travel.
Gotcha. Yeah, we had some healthy debate in this household after we were listening to your TED Talk and some of the recommended changes. I would love to talk about some of those. Do you want to ask your question?
How does locally sourced food help carbon emissions?
That is a great question. So when we think about, this is how I learned when I was doing it, was I got just super curious about what is the carbon emissions of food? What does that even mean? And actually that was my first question when I saw the documentary Food Inc. and I was in college. And I decided to build a spreadsheet to better understand where those emissions came from all the way in the supply chain. And what I learned is that something like food, for instance, the majority of the emissions from food come from actually producing that food. So that's like the water and energy and food that, or plant matter, fertilizer that's required to actually produce it. If it's meat, then it's all the food that goes to the animals for them to eat it. And so maybe that's like 60 to 80% of the carbon impact of the food we eat comes from just what you're eating. But then there's also impacts associated with getting it to you. So that transporting it and packaging it and distributing it. And then there's also end of life use, like what happens after you eat it, composting, or does it go to landfill? Does it decompose? Those kinds of things. Yes. So something like locally sourced food helps address two things. One is that maybe it helps with local production. So maybe something produced close to you seasonally is actually using less resources than something that's trying, in a warehouse being manufactured or using a lot of energy and water to produce off season, for instance. So if it's local and seasonal, that can affect some of the production, that like 60 to 80%. And it can especially affect the maybe like 15 to 20% that has to do with distribution and transportation. So if it doesn't have to be shipped across the country or air freighted in, like sometimes like even things that are really perishable and that are not available locally, like flowers, if they're flown in from like the Netherlands or Ethiopia, where a lot of our flowers are flown in from, those flowers are actually brought on a plane and then they're traveling at a super high carbon footprint per product. So that way, like buying local wildflowers or growing your own flowers has so much lower footprint. And so that's where a lot of the localization makes a difference.
Ooh, I like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question.
So one of the other things we had a lot of debate about that got us to eating more locally sourced foods was the point about on your website, you had a stat that was something like eating a beef burger is the equivalent of driving a gas car for a half hour or 30 miles or something like that, right? And my husband is a significant meat eater and
Yes.
loves meat, especially the red meats. So does this one and my other son. And so Ian had made an announcement that today was his last meat eating day, and to which Mike said, absolutely not, we're not doing that. But his point was the avocado that I eat travels as far, to your point, travels and doesn't get here, spends as much carbon getting here as maybe the beef burger does. So do we need to completely cut meat, or is it, just move to chicken, or is it more getting to locally sourced? Like, what would be your take on that type of debate, and how do we change our behavior as a family?
This is such a great example because I feel like there's so many people in the situation. I'm one of them. That's like, there's all these things people are telling me to do to be more sustainable. I can't do all of them.
Yes.
Like, where do I start? Right? What
Yeah.
matters the most? And that's what I think carbon footprinting can be super helpful for, just helping us prioritize a little bit. Is like, yeah, ideally all of us would eat vegan, organic food grown in our own backyard, but that's like really hard to do.
So hard.
So what do we do? Like, maybe we don't have a backyard. Maybe we live in a cold place. We need to buy stuff to live, and that's how our economy works. So that's where I think this like framework of where emissions comes from is really helpful. So 60 to 80% of our emissions from food comes from like just what you eat. So that's the most important thing to pay attention to, especially where we get our protein is the thing that matters most. Red meat is about 5 times more carbon footprint than white meat. So even just cutting down from red meat to white meat is a huge action. So you don't have to go like fully vegetarian or vegan to have a really big impact. So if you switch out beef or lamb for chicken or fish, even pork has a much lower footprint than beef or lamb, then you can make a much lower carbon footprint. So that's one thing, is wherever possible, where it's easy, you can switch those things out.
Okay.
Also, now we have great red meat alternatives sometimes with Impossible and Beyond.
Yeah.
It's not like they're necessarily healthier than red meat is. They have a lot of the same
They're
saturated
definitely not.
fat,
Yeah.
trans fat, stuff like that. But they have about 80 to 90% less carbon than a burger, for instance. So it does make a huge difference. It's a great way to sub it out. For me, that's made it much easier personally, because I do love burgers, and that's a great way to sub it. Then if you're shifting from like white meat to vegetarian, you can cut your impact by about 3x. So that's also a big impact. So when you find things that you like that are plant-based proteins like tofu or beans or even other types like yogurt, sometimes, especially plant-based yogurts, although yogurt does have pretty high carbon footprint if you eat a lot of it. But those can be really great substitutes as well. I personally find it very hard to go like totally vegetarian. I grew up in a family that eats meat, but we ate a lot of vegetarian food too. But I knew that if I switched, I could probably be fully vegetarian for a week, for a month, maybe for a year, but I wanted to do something that I could actually sustain, like sustainable. It means, can I do it? Can I sustain it? And does it mean, it means like, is the whole world going to be better if everyone lives this way? So those were my kind of 2 principles when I was thinking about what to prioritize. So I decided I can cut down my meat consumption a lot and have a really big impact. So I cut down my meat consumption from 12 meals a week to 2 meals a week. And I had the equivalent of taking half a car off the road in a year. That was my impact.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be all or nothing. And now I eat 1 meal of meat a week, usually on my Friday or Saturday night, and where I can look forward to, and it's also nice because that means I really prioritize having really good meat and really enjoying it and savoring it when I do.
Yeah. I was just thinking it's probably like a giant steak at a nice restaurant or something like that, right?
Yeah, whatever is your cheat meal. For me, sometimes it's like going to a ramen restaurant or having a fried chicken sandwich.
Yeah, you're speaking his language. So other than food, I saw in some of your articles too, it was talking about transport and flying. We went through the app to see what our carbon footprint was. I think we're above average of your Joro users, less than US average, but still kind of high. But transport was another one that it talked about, how often are you commuting? What are you driving? How many short haul, long haul flights are you taking? What are some considerations that we should be, especially for us traveling for the next 6 months, what are things we should be thinking about or prioritizing as we're moving around or looking for as we travel?
Yes. So travel is one of those things that is powered by fossil fuels, no matter how you think about it. I mean, unless you can go in an electric vehicle everywhere, or you can get on one of those amazing boats that Greta was on, that's powered by the sun,
Yeah.
it's hard to avoid because all of our travel is based on fossil fuels. Some principles I like to keep in mind are first, mode of transportation matters a lot. So flights are a lot more carbon intensive usually than most other ways of getting places, although sometimes driving in a very gas inefficient car can also be similar in terms of the carbon footprint. If you do have to get on a plane, you're going somewhere far enough away that you can't avoid it, then as much as possible, trying to combine trips so that you can reduce flights is super helpful. So if you're planning your route, and it's probably the most cost effective too, to make sure you keep going in the right direction, like don't go forward and then back, and then you have to increase the flight emissions. If you can like go a certain amount of distance and then cut out flights locally, if you can take a train or a bus between locations that are closer together, and cut out especially short haul flights that are less than a 5-hour drive as an alternative. Those are great places to look at bus routes or train routes, or renting a car, especially if you can rent a hybrid or e-vehicle. If you can drive with more than one person in the car, then it's almost always much better than flying. When you do book flights, there's actually a bunch of things you can do to book flights that have lower carbon footprints. You can cut the footprint of a flight by almost 45%, depending on what kind of flight you book. The things that matter most are if you bought an economy class or not. Economy class, obviously much more efficient. If there's lots more people on the plane, then they can run fewer routes with more people. And then flying direct also, because a lot of the emissions come from takeoff and landing. About a third of the emissions, 25 to 30%, come from takeoff and landing. And then also think about when you're in a destination, what you can do to make it more sustainable. If you can stay in an Airbnb, that might be more sustainable than staying in a hotel, because you're not using new resources. It's like a home that would already be there. And often residential buildings are more effective with energy use than big commercial ones, or staying in hotels that prioritize being eco-friendly. What you eat and how you travel locally obviously matters the same way it does in your normal life as well.
Yeah, so we did, I will say we are in the back of the plane in economy, but a lot of travel, and 4 of us, we're definitely in the back. So by default, we're doing a good job there.
And budget airlines book a lot more people per plane, so it's good for your wallet if you book budget airlines too.
Yeah, exactly. But we are staying in a lot of Airbnbs, and we did try to stay close to town, one, because we want to be part of the community, but also because we thought it would be efficient to walk and not have to rent a car or get an Uber.
That makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is just too what's easy when you're traveling. Just being around a community makes a difference. So if we're traveling and we're using the Joro app, one of the things we were interested in seeing, and we haven't actually gotten to use it yet. So I'd love your perspective. Is it tracking it by day, by week? Can we track it by location so we can see in each location, are we better or worse in our behavior or estimated costs as we travel around the world?
So interesting. I would love to keep in touch with you as you travel to see how the app holds up in different locations. But yes, you can see, so you can see your footprint over time for sure. You can look at it by day, by week. It's organized by month, but you can click in and go look at your carbon footprint over the course of that month. You can also see the breakdown by category. So you can see, even if you click in within food, what's driving my footprint? Is it restaurants? Is it bars? Is it grocery shops? Those kinds of things. We don't currently allow you to filter it by location, but I think that's a really interesting idea. And we'd love to stay in touch on that. And we do, regardless of where you are in the world, we can translate what you're purchasing into dollars. And so then we'll estimate the emissions based on dollars. What will be slightly off is like sometimes if you're if you're in a rural area in India, maybe the carbon footprint of your groceries will be lower because it's much more local or like less resource intensive. And we don't yet account for different countries besides the US and Canada.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. All right. I definitely will keep you posted on our blog. We're going to try to come up with some creative way to be able to report out, but I'll definitely keep in touch with you too.
For sure. We'll see if we can help you.
Yeah. Do you want to ask your question here?
How can I as a kid affect my carbon emissions?
Great question. I think that this is something interesting for people who are kids or who live in a home where they're not the primary person making decisions about spending. a lot of what you can do is influence the people around you. So if you make a decision like, I'm not going to eat red meat anymore, or I'm going to eat less red meat, that's going to make your parents pay attention to how they're going to spend their money and how they're going to choose to plan their meals. Also, you have a unique ability to influence other people your age. So if you can share it with other people, then those people can also influence their parents and families or their schools and communities that they're a part of. I think that is a really powerful thing, because probably the people who are in your communities are going to be a lot more interested and aware of these issues than people who are maybe in my communities, for instance. So I think that's actually a really powerful position to be in, to influence your family unit, your school, your friend group. And then also you have a lot more credibility because you're going to be on Earth for longer. So I feel like you need to use that to your advantage. Is like, I'm actually here for maybe longer than you're going to be around. 2050 is like really not that far from now. 2030 is not that far from now. And that's the world that you're trying to think about, the world you're actually going to live in, which gives you, I think, a lot more credibility than older generations do.
Does that help? Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Yeah. Is there something you were already thinking of that you can do when you get home?
Well, no, not really.
Not yet. Still to come?
Yes.
Okay, good. You did say something about food waste that I wanted to ask about. So in addition to buying changing the behaviors of the food that we buy, tell us a little bit about food waste and its impact and how that's accounted for, because one of the things that we are really great at is science experiments in our refrigerator, which is
Yes.
food waste that goes in the trash or down the drain. When we buy something, we would take into account that carbon footprint, but isn't there a carbon footprint on that other end that we would need to account for? And how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's not easy. So a lot of carbon footprint approaches, and the ones that we use in the app, go all the way from production to sale to the consumer. So it's called cradle, or like origination, to gate, which is where it's actually sold at the store, and then to threshold, which is where it's sold to the consumer. So our estimates go from cradle to threshold. Then there's also using products, and then where they go to live after you use them. In the use phase, we can often account for your carbon footprint based on things like your utilities or your home energy use, because that's what a lot of the carbon footprint of use, like clothing and stuff like that, comes from. How many times are you washing it, or are you turning on the lights and using your products and services in your home? But end of life use is hard, because everything decomposes differently, and it also depends on whether you're recycling and composting or not, and what the waste systems look like where you are. We're actually working on some stuff in the app right now that we're going to try to release in probably the first few months of the new year, that will allow us to better show people the carbon footprint of food waste in particular.
Oh yeah.
So you can input some information about where you live and what your food waste situation is, and we can help you see the carbon footprint of your food, and then also help you tailor some recommendations of what you can do to where you live, because not everyone has access to municipal composting. So depending on where you live, there's different things you can do about it. So that's still an area that we're developing, is sort of end of life use, and how do we help people make good decisions there.
Yeah, I would personally love that. Like I said, because of our science experiments, but also because we don't have municipal composting and we have tried it.
It's very hard.
It's really hard.
It's really hard.
I mean, I cannot compost for the life of me. So
yeah. Well,
any how-to tutorials.
There's some good new tabletop composters coming out. So that's still sort of an area for tech innovation, I think, but there's some new ones coming out soon. So hopefully we'll have some more information about that.
Yeah, I would love to see that. We did try to fund one on a Kickstarter, but we haven't gotten it yet. And it was like middle of COVID. So I'm still crossing my fingers that it'll show up one day.
Good to be hopeful, but
5 years later.
5 years later.
One thing I'd be really curious about as you're traveling to learn about is if you're seeing things in the places you're traveling to that we could learn from. And so in terms of like, so many people in different places have developed sustainable practices that we've just forgotten, or that haven't been widely used. For instance, there's someone on our team who is from the Philippines. She's living in the Philippines, and she was telling us about how she's like, oh yeah, you guys throw away your banana peels? That's so weird. We always turn them into fertilizer at my house.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, how do you do that? And we just put them in some vinegar. There's actually a video, I think, on our Instagram about how to do that. But I was so surprised that there are just some really easy practices that people in other parts of the world are doing and that we just don't know about or haven't heard about.
Yeah.
So I would love to see if there's things we could learn from your travels and share it with the community.
I would love to do that. And we can make it an educational exercise for you since we'll be homeschooling. I'm
Yay.
trying to come up with all of those.
So excited.
Awesome. Well, did you have any other questions, Ian?
No,
Okay. And did you have any other recommendations? That's a great one, Sanchali, just for us while we're traveling that we should be thinking about or considering.
I would love to see if there's anything that we can help with also on your trip as you go to different places, if we've done research on carbon footprints or emissions in different places. And if we have specific questions there, I'd love to send them your way. But I'm just so excited to learn from your travels. It's a great way to expand horizons.
We will see. I'll send you our itinerary and let me know what we can look for and provide back to the community. We would love to.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Sanchali. It was really good to talk to you today.
Great to meet you.